Hi there, and welcome to the second virtual bash, and an extra special welcome to anybody attending for the first time. I'm Garth Gilmore, your continuity announcer, so it's my job to be loud and take all the credit. In the background, we have Zara and Ryan, so they're doing all the organization and managing the Zoom call. So today's theme is ethics, and we have three excellent speakers for you. I should warn you, I have not previewed their material in any way. So if you leave this meetup as an existentialist, it's no fault of mine. Although of course you will believe that it is, okay? So we have a few quick announcements before we begin. So the next bash will be a serverless bash in late June. We have three excellent presenters for that as well. And we hope to make an announcement in the next week. So stay tuned for that. And then the bash after that will be a craft bash. So we're still looking for one local presenter for that. So if you would like to volunteer to be a speaker at bash around the theme of software craftsmanship, please let us know. We'll be very, very happy to give you any support that you might need. So before we start in, the only remaining point is this is a family show. So all swearing will be under the good place conventions. So with all that forking shirt out of the way, on with the show. Yeah. So I'd like to call on John to do the first talk. So if you can please share your video and audio.
Yeah. Hi, Garth. Absolutely.
Hi there.
So shall I share? Shall I start going?
Absolutely.
Here we go. So hopefully you can all now see my presentation. Yeah. So hi, I'm John Nolan. I'm a technologist of over 30 years writing and delivering code. And I've worked in the oil industry and in investment banking. I've worked with the betting industry and the chemical industry. So I know a lot about technology and ethics, if only because I need to find forgiveness for many of the things I was involved in. But I hope that the way I executed my technical responsibilities and my professional responsibilities was always ethical. And that's one of the reasons I do sessions like this about technology ethics. When I talked to Garth about this, I asked him, well, was there a subject or something that we could use, and he suggested this one. Now, normally when I do ethics discussions, I do it as guided questioning. I like to interact with technologists and talk about it, because ethics is about how we do things, and to me it's an active thing you do, and it's a conversation. It's not about somebody lecturing you and saying this is right and wrong. So given this is Mental Health Awareness Week, and I hope you are all participating in kindness is the theme we're on. Please be kind and forgiving and compassionate about my inability not to do this presentation in my normal way. And I'm going to try and avoid being lectury, but we'll see how that works out, shan't we? So, so normally what I would do is I would say, well, let's look at this. So social media is given credence, a source of information, conventional journalism, and government reports. What are the responsibilities as technologists that we have in this context? So the first thing was, well, how does ethics help with this question? So let's deconstruct it. So let's think about that word responsibilities. This implies we have a responsibility because we are technologists. And there's a line of ethics which talks about the privilege of being in a role in a society. And the idea is that because we have the privilege of being a technologist, the society has offered us the opportunities, we've had the background, the education, the access, and that we are now in this place that we are technologists, and that we owe something back to society to make it a better place. And this is the deontological view, and it's very action oriented. And this is where that question, what ought I to do, comes from. And ought is actually derived from the concept of owe. So in Old Norse, I think it is, and ought comes from owing, and it is literally asking, what do I owe others? What should I do? So there's a deontological action-oriented view that we could take to this question. But then on the other side, when you look at it, we're talking about the role of a technologist in a context. And when you're getting into roles and contexts and society, you start talking about Aristotle. You can't avoid talking about Aristotle when you start talking about roles. And that question is the how to live well as a technologist. How, in a eudaimonia sense is the word he uses. So that's kind of not just being well off, but how do you execute your responsibilities and feel satisfied that you're doing your part and contributing to make society a better place. And the questions in there are all questions of character, and that's the virtue ethics view. But of course, this statement in itself, social media as a given credence source of information, is an outcome. And so we could actually look at that from a consequentialist kind of view. And the consequentialist view of the world is that what you should judge what you do based on the outcomes, the greatest good, the best outcome. So in trying to answer this question about what responsibilities do we have, we could actually take those three different viewpoints, those three different fundamental different views of ethics, the action-oriented, the outcome-oriented, and the character-oriented, and then ask that question about how does this make society a better place. Now, key in this is that often we concentrate on ethics, the thing. What action should we do? What character should we have? What outcomes should we be looking at? And we forget that the purpose of ethics is to make society a better place. We get distracted by thinking about the questions and the personal and don't think, well, what we're actually trying to achieve is make society a better place. So I'm suggesting here that we can use a knowledge of ethics and an understanding of ethics to examine this given statement and then come up with some ideas about what we can do and how we might develop our virtues to be better and learn from it. Now, there's obviously very many different viewpoints in here that we could take. So we could say, what about how we use social media? What should we do as a technologist using social media? But the version I'm going to use here is what can we learn about how social media was created to produce this situation? Now, before we proceed, I want you to take a small moment and think about the statement itself. Is that a positive or a negative thing? It's interesting that when we use the word credence, people often go, oh, well, look, that's a negative, it's a judgmental thing. But actually, it can be a good thing. You could argue that this is a good thing. The use of social media has driven many social movements, has highlighted problems. The Snowden exposés, for example, about privacy were driven by social media. But on the other side, you run into subjects like anti-vax and some of those kind of things, which are considered problematic and harmful. And the whole subject of fake news and how things are changing. So one thing is stepping back and we're using this, and we're not going to be judging that statement. We're going to look at that mechanism. So let's start with the consequentialist view. What was the outcome? There's a question you can ask about what were the ethics that were used and what was the principles and the approach. And the target outcome that you heard at the time, and we still hear, is this concept of an equal voice and fairness, empowering individuals, and the value in free-flowing information. Breaking down what was seen as institutions that were not representative of certain people, minorities, and sections of the population, and that we felt they weren't being listened to. And so this is quite what the Americans would call a very liberal view of the world. There's nothing wrong with it. It is an ethical stance. But the question is, what happened? What was the outcome? So one of the things we have to remember as technologists is that when we create technology and put it out there, we are creating new roles and new types of people in the world. So for the example that's always given is before the violin was invented, there was no such thing as a violinist. And it is that idea that we have to think about the roles we're creating. And those roles then produce new behaviors, positive and negative. So the behaviors of online appreciation can be positive, but trolling and shame storming are new behaviors that occurred at volume because of these mechanisms that were put in place with the best of intentions. And from that follow virtues and vices. Courageous publishing, as I said, the Snowden exposés. One could argue WikiLeaks was courageous publishing, but then we have reckless moderation, which one could consider a vice. So in actually targeting and making things happen, we create these new elements of roles, behaviors, virtues, and vices. If we look at what the actual outcome became, and yes, I'm using a slightly negative version here, but this is the whole point of going through it and thinking of it in many different ways. What actually happened was we ended up with certain voices being drowned out, in increased amounts of minoritization, and minoritization here doesn't mean small groups. Minoritization means being pushed aside by the mechanisms of power. So, for example, women were minoritized even though they were the majority of the population in sort of, through history, but they were minoritized because they weren't in place and had power to make things happen. And oppression happens. And instead of going from using value in free-flowing information, we've ended up value is in attention, and we ended up with this attention economy. So even though the best of intentions was there with the developers, and never considered these people didn't think they were trying to do a good thing, where we've ended up is a very different place. And so what happened? What can we learn from this? Well, there's a book I can recommend recently published called Data Feminism, and it uses critical feminist approach to ethics to look at data in particular. It's by D'Ignacio and Klein, and they've come up with this term privilege hazard. And it's quite good. I quite like it because it actually captures some of the stuff I've talked about before, and I'm fully giving them credit for it. And the idea of privilege hazard is that the people who are aiming at that target outcome were unaware of the mechanisms of power that they and their privilege and where they were, and they'd never suffered some of the forms of oppression, of minoritization, of how power can be used and manipulated against groups and individuals. And so you didn't even imagine that this could happen, that the sunlit uplands of the equal voice, fairness, and empowerment were always there. So the issue, let's take, for example, equal voice and fairness. The problem is, if we think of equality and fairness, what we're not talking about is equity, an equitable outcome versus an equal outcome. And so the example is, if we said, well, let's all just take the gross domestic product of the country and divide it evenly by all the people, and everybody gets the same amount of money from now on. That's equality, and that seems fair to some people. But the point is, it's not equitable because we already have advantage from our privilege. I live in a very nice house in the Scottish countryside. A friend of mine lives in a very nasty house in the middle of a city. Is it fair and equitable that we divide the world that way? And that's the difference between equality and equity. And being aware of those differences and moving towards that idea of justice with equity. So, for example, let's take the carbon problem and climate change. The UK, the Industrial Revolution, we've benefited hugely from the exploitation of carbon. But should we now be fair and impose the same levels on everybody else? So that's kind of the question of equality and equity. So there is privilege hazard in not just understanding, not being aware that it can be happen. And so that's where you kind of get to this problem of the intended outcome and what actually ends up, and that's privilege hazard. So if we took privilege hazard and then looked at the other two angles on it, so privilege hazard, I'm suggesting, is part of the thing we have to understand responsibility about. So let's look at what actions should we take. Well, usually I do this with questions and answers and interaction, obviously, but here are a few examples. These are not total answers, but they're suggested ones. So the classic feminist thing of examine the structures of power. Understand what you're involved in, look at the policies and cultures and look at the everyday that's embedded and empowered in there. So be aware of it and examine it. Align towards justice, equity, and co-liberation. Don't align towards being ethical. Understand what the outcomes you're aiming at in ethics are. And these are qualities which are outside yourself and they're part of society. So it's orienting and understanding that stuff. One of the things which I'm very keen on is opening up plans and intentions to public scrutiny to hear opinions. So early on in any situation, I believe a technologist should be trying to make intentions and ideas public and open to scrutiny. Our secrecy, I think, is actually harmful, and the belief that we have to do things before we get out there is harmful, especially this just push it out in the market and then we can listen to the market, I think is particularly pernicious. So I think there's an action about opening up early and being very clear about it. Actively seeking oversight of people who are not just directly involved. And this is from a recent conversation with my friend John Mason. Instead of just looking at postcards from the future as happy futures, send a few dystopian futures. Think about how it could go wrong. But think about how it could go wrong by engaging with people who understand how the world can go wrong when you're minoritized, oppressed, ignored. But what about the other side then? Character and virtues. What could we do there? So, which vices do we have? What virtues to develop? Well, in this we could say, what are the vices of privilege hazard? And there's a list over confidence and certainty, insulism, secrecy, and what virtues could we develop on the other side? Humility, and then friendly tolerance and trust, which are known as the basic virtues or the common virtues according to Ignativ. And compassion is understanding the difference between empathy and compassion. And the conversation would be, how do we develop these virtues amongst us? So my suggestion here is that in order to understand the responsibility we might have in this context, we could use ethics in order to ask those questions. And ethics can point us in the direction of the means by which we might to achieve that end that we're looking for, which is a better society. And that better society is determined with equity, justice, and co-liberty. And this is the mechanism by which technology ethics, I think, comes to bear and crosses over with traditional ethics. So that's the end of my stint, Garth. At this point, is it questions, or would you like to?
Absolutely. If you just stop sharing your screen there, please. Yeah. So just to ask a couple of questions. So the first one relating to the idea of privilege hazard. So I mean, if I can add to the question by taking my own experiences, I mean, my father grew up during the Second World War, and his entire approach to life and the way he approached financial decisions and life choices and so on was colored by his experiences. So do you think we all here in Western Europe have a form of privilege hazard, and that we're a long way from a major disaster or a world war or some kind of fundamental reality shock, and we don't realize just how serious things can be, and that in some ways affects the negative aspects of our reaction to the current panic over the virus?
That's a lot. That bit at the end was really large. So I think privilege hazard, I think we all have privilege hazard. That our life experiences and our opportunities and what we've done, and that we become blind to the effects of what we're doing, the secondary effects, the tertiary effects. And this goes to Hannah Ardent's idea of the banality of evil, that we don't even think of it. I'm just doing my part, and that we live in that way. And that's kind of it's understanding the privilege to being able to say, oh, well, I'm just doing my part, for example. And the privilege has a point is that it's not intentional. You're not a bad person. It's understanding that exists and how to expose it and go and open yourself up to understand how other people have suffered being minoritized, the everyday language of of things, the oppression of not having pockets in female clothing, for example, those kind of things, which are sort of beyond your understanding if you don't get why it affects the way you think and what you do. And so it's been open to understanding that. The co-liberty things is related to that, because the concept of co-liberty goes beyond just freedom and liberty. It talks up to the fact that co-liberty is that when you don't even know you're oppressing somebody, when you free them, you free yourself. Is that we can actually all kind of get better. The society goes better if we both are liberated by that kind of thing, that you're actually limiting yourself. So I would say the privilege hazard, the awareness of privilege hazard, is that to be aware that we all have it, and then what actions can we take? And that's my suggestion, that we need to be more open sooner and engage people.
Very good, very good. So then the second question there, the idea that with social media and so on, it gives people more of an equal voice, and going back to your ideas about equity and so on. do you think it's necessary that we always have some kind of aristocracy, you know, for lack of a better term, that there's always some authority there that's filtering the information that's coming in and saying, okay, the amount of voice that you get should be proportional to your expertise in some topic?
So I think there should be mechanisms in place for that. I think that is where conventional journalism comes in. I think that is also the position of government. I think we are now in a position where we can step back and start asking the more serious mechanisms about that. The problem with the equal voice thing is that we've converted it to say all viewpoints have the same value, and that's not the same thing. And that's the difference between equity and equality. So if we all have the same volume, we're saying they all have the same validity. And if you look at, you know, the climate change thing is quite interesting, because it is that, oh, well, we have to put the opposite thing at the same, even though you've got 9 scientists saying one thing and 1 scientist saying the other. It's how we give that proportionality. And journalism, we have to remember, journalism came out of publications and pamphleting and the sort of the madness that anybody could publish, and they developed a sense of ethics and what it took in order to do this. How do you be representative? How do you do it fairly? How do you report and try and produce that? There's still power involved in that, and that's where you have to look at the structures of power and the language and what's been used. But I do think we need those mechanisms. So I think we have to develop it, and that's part of this ethical conversation. And it's how to restructure and think of it. But I think you still need dissent, and you need mechanisms of dissent so that voice is heard. But I think we do need mechanisms to illustrate how society wishes to see and what we think about it, and be representative of that.
Yes, yeah, very good. And then finally, just to return to your original point about owing something to society, do you think this is something that has broken down in more recent years, or does every generation believe that this is something that's continuously breaking down, or are there new things like, you know, libertarian politics and stuff that are acting to kind of erode this sense that people have?
I think that I didn't get one of the other pieces of analysis you can do, which is to ask about how is social media driving a nihilistic view of the world. You know, the bonfire, you know, the bonfire of the emotions, and, you know, the individualism and all those kind of things. I think there's a political analysis, because there's also the question of the technologist as a political force, and what we're doing to change that. But I think it's how we see what we owe, you know, and that we are part of that society, and that we're not just a customer of the society, that we actually are part. And I actually think there's sort of almost, we're going to such an extreme that it's beginning to become obvious, and we're bouncing back in the other direction. But I think the nihilistic effects of social media, I think, are quite difficult to deal with.
Yes.
But I think it's producing a greater sense of there being a society, and we ought to do something. But that understanding of it as owing, I think, has eroded, because, you know, I blame the Enlightenment for a lot of things, and I think the Enlightenment sort of put it up there and then failed to show how it actually could be a workable and usable thing to think about. But yes. Yeah, I think it's not a common thing to think about, which is one of the reasons I emphasize it.
Very good. So final question, and this may be something that we can tweet out or whatever, but are there any good resources you would recommend for people trying to read themselves into and get started in this area?
So I think, so there's a couple of books. So Shannon Valler's The Technology and the Virtues is one I often quote, especially in this area, because she talks about techno-justice, techno-libertarianism and things like this. And it's a very good introduction to virtue ethics as well, even if you were just interested in virtue ethics. I think the book I quoted, Data Feminism, the D'Ignacio and Klein one, I think it's probably the best exposition of feminist ethics I've seen. I've seen, full stop, let alone the fact that it's about data and data science. I think if you're going to read a couple of books, they're the ones. If you want to get deeper into the stuff, Alistair McIntyre, After Virtue, and of course, just read Aristotle. But, you know,
of course,
that's the hard stuff.
Yeah. Just sorry, one late entry on the question list here. I'm just glancing at. So, what are your thoughts on the likes of Facebook and Google using phone location data to make disease prevention maps and so on in relation to the COVID pandemic. And as you know, there's this argument going on about should there be a mobile app, and if there is a mobile app, should it be local, or should all the data be thrown up into the cloud, and how should it then be used and so on?
Well, I would encourage the viewers to consider privilege hazard in this context. We are considering that, oh, well, you know, everybody has a mobile phone, don't they? Everybody understands the privacy impacts and knows how to control it and what the consequences are. And the sunlit upland, the postcard from the future is that we can automatically be told and be warned about these things. But we don't talk about the dystopian ones from the future. And what does that mean? The normalization of tracking and tracing through those phones and the surveillance, and what does that mean? That we just expect it, and the normalization of that kind of stuff. I think there's, you know, the privilege hazard associated with, you know, those who are most vulnerable tend not to actually have the devices that would be enabled to do those things as well. So we're kind of ignoring it. And, you know, again, how do we see the people who've been oppressed by that kind of technology being able to inform us about it? Go and talk to certain employees who work in certain warehousing systems where they are tracked and traced and looked at. And that was okay, it's only about doing efficiency. And suddenly it doesn't turn into only being about efficiency, it turns into judging you on a different kind of level. So I think it's a big question to be examined. You know, I have strong opinions, obviously, but I think the mechanisms, I think this mechanism of asking that, and particularly that point of privilege hazard, I think we need to be careful about, and that's the thing to consider.
Just a follow on from that then. So do you think the privilege hazard of COVID is different from other diseases, and that most other diseases would hit the very young and the very old, whereas this is one that seems to hit the very old more than the very young?
Oh, well, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a vet and is a virologist the other day, and she was more worried about the ones that are going across between species backwards and forwards. And I think I think we have to be very careful with this. You know, is COVID a special thing? It's the first one of a special thing. Pandemics are of different forms. But you know, outside of the given context, I would say I don't think it's particularly special. I think in terms of asking the ethical question about how are we going to deal with situations like this, I think we need to ask. And also, you know, this is an existential threat, to use one of the words you used up front. And we have other existential threats like climate change, which I think we have to think about in a similar kind of manner. I know, how do we do collective action on these things, and how do we as technologists help on the ethical side of things, not just the practical side of things.
Yes. Very good. Well, listen, thank you so much for answering those. So okay. If I can banish you for the moment. So
happily be banished. Thank you, guys. Yes. And thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you. So if you can stop your video and mute, yeah, and then if I can ask Gillian to come onto the stage. Hello there. Hi there.
Hello.
I shall disappear now.
Excellent. So ethics is a really hard topic. So I thought today that I would try and make it a little bit more simple by taking it back to some lessons that you already learned when you were little. As Gareth said, I'm Gillian. I work in Liberty IT in Belfast. I am a long-term BASH attendee, so many of you probably already know me from that or one of the other various meetups or conferences. But for those of you who don't, I'm a software developer, and most of my work over the past few years has been focused on AI and cloud technologies. Now, we don't have much time today, so I'm going to be covering everything really, really quickly and at a high level, but I have included loads of links for you in the slides. And don't panic when you see those. I will be sharing them out afterwards. I will tweet out a link, so look out for that. Now that you've met me, I want to introduce you to two people, two real people, whose story, when I heard it a few years ago, massively affected me as a developer. This is Nancy and Jason, and they both live in Michigan, and they both had to file for unemployment in the past. They were also both accused of filing for unemployment fraudulently and given huge fines that the state was able to start deducting automatically from their wages. Jason was told he had committed fraud several years before, and he now owed $70,000. $62,000 of that was penalties, and $7,000 of that was interest. Nancy ended up filing for bankruptcy because she couldn't pay her bills after the state started taking a quarter of her wages. Neither of them had actually committed fraud. Neither of them could find out why they were being fined or any way to dispute it. And that was because they had been accused of fraud by a computer system called Midas that ran for 2 years without any human oversight, identifying 20,000 people it thought had committed fraud. And when it was finally audited, it was found to have an error rate of 93%. 93%. Thousands and thousands of people put in financial hardship completely unfairly because of it. And it wasn't an AI system. It was a rules-based one. They just wrote flawed rules and nobody was checking. Now, I said we were going to embrace our inner 5-year-old. And so I think 5-year-olds love to ask questions. So I think the word why is a great place to start those lessons. So the first why is for me. Why AI ethics? Isn't ethics important for all of software development, given what I have just said? Well, absolutely. But AI presents a very interesting topic because generally the harm done is several layers removed from the creation. Look at the harm that was done without any AI in that Midas system, but we can trace it back to where the problem happened. In machine learning systems, it can be hard to trace back where the blame should lie when things go wrong. Is it the developer, the person who trained the model, the person who wrote the algorithm, the person who got the data? We have ways of understanding and dealing with human incompetence or wrongdoing, but in AI, it can be a lot more complex than that. So if you're kicking off an AI project yourself, let me give you some questions. And the first one is, why are you building it? No, seriously, is it something that should be built at all? Just because you can build something doesn't mean you should. When we do projects, we assess all sorts of things with privacy, security, cost. Why should you not be doing the same to measure the cost you might have to other humans? Now, Dave Anderson, who no doubt many of you know, and myself have been trialing out in our work something we're currently calling a human impact statement. You'll see lots of other things, similar things out there. And I'm going to give you a very short version of that. It's something you should work with as many people as possible to write down and share with everybody who's involved. So first things first, what are you creating? We're used to having business requirements and a business question that we have to answer, but having a machine learning question may be new to you. And it's one of the key things here, because computers aren't that smart. You're going to have to make the question really clear. And then be aware that the machine will answer that question and only that question. You'll get nothing for free. We'll come back to that. Next, who is involved? Who are your stakeholders? Who's actually involved in the creation? And who might you be impacting? Not just your users, think bigger, and take away any value judgments at this point as you write them down. Everything, no matter what you think, good, bad, indifferent, you're capturing these to start to create the conversations. And consider if you can really speak for those people. We live in a little bit of a bubble in tech. John talked about that privilege. Don't assume that you can imagine what other people would think. For instance, simple thing, just because you personally wouldn't want to do a particular job doesn't mean that nobody does, or that it should be wholesale automated. If you aren't an SME in the area you're impacting, you need to find people that are, and you need to listen to them. So let's go back to the why. Why are you creating this? Who is getting something out of it? Generally, people, and companies especially, don't tend to build things for purely selfless reasons. Keep that firmly fixed in your mind. Business goals are likely to be one of the strongest pulls in any project, and they may not always be aligned to ethical ones. I wish I could remember who said it, but I think a great quote is that if you dig in any ethically grey area, you will find a whole heap of money. If there wasn't a whole heap of money there, it wouldn't be ethically grey. And if you know the why, do you know the how? How are decisions getting made? Are people accountable? And for your machine learning, where did you get that data from? Was it collected specifically for this purpose or for something else? How did it get collected? Was it a self-selecting group? Is it complete? It's really important to understand that. And then what happens next? How are you going to know if something has gone wrong or if something's gone really amazingly right? Like, we don't have time to delve into all of those things. So let me give you some more ideas. Here's some links you can follow and think more about it. But once you've taken that and you've written down your human impact statement, then we're going to reach the second lesson from a 5-year-old. Call out when that's not fair. I'm sure you've never heard a child say that. I'm sure you've never said that when you were a child. That's not fair. You know what? You need to be willing to stand up and say when there are ethical issues. So let's loop back to that data. Garbage in, garbage out, and bias in, bias out. And bias in data can just be about unbalanced data. It just doesn't have proper representation of all the groups it needs to. You can get that from something as simple as just not collecting it well. But you'll also notice that I've written a get it done attitude at the bottom there. We love a get it done attitude in software development. Executives love it especially. But a get it done attitude is going to steamroller everything in the way of pursuit of business goals. And that can be a problem because if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. And if you want a particular answer from the data so you can succeed, look for it long enough and you will find it, potentially at the expense of the real story the data is telling. But how do you know if the results you're getting out are unfair? How do you measure fairness? How do you even define fairness? Well, the dictionary says that fairness is impartial and just treatment or behavior without favoritism or discrimination. But that's not very measurable. So let's try out a statistical definition. Here's one that's been suggested. Fairness is when we have equal false negative rates across groups. So when we make predictions, we make the same amount of mistakes in every group. We do equal harm to everyone. So let's look at that. Let's flip it. Let's make a really simple scenario. We're going to actually try to do equal good to each group here. We have a population of red and yellow stars and circles, and we want to make sure we're not discriminating based on color or on shape. And in this case, we're going to give out a prize that's random. There's no element of merit at all. Now, remember what we said before. Computer will only answer the question you gave it. So a common technique of removing any features that could be used to discriminate, so color or shape, may not be a good technique, because if you don't ask for fairness and you don't tell the computer what you want it to be fair with, then you're not going to get it. You can't put constraints into a model for specific features if the model doesn't know about them. So we're going to need to keep them in there. And in this case, we have a perfectly equal population. And our system has been given its fairness criteria. So you would probably look at this and think, okay, so one of each group is going to get a prize. One red circle, one red star, one yellow circle, one yellow star. Except here's what the computer gave us. Exactly what we asked for. Equal red and yellow and equal circle and star. Is that fair? Well, if you're a red star or a yellow circle, you might not think so. But that just shows how easy it is, even when you're trying to put fairness guardrails on, that you can still not get it quite right. Or let's look at a different definition. Here's another one that's been suggested. Similar individuals should be treated similarly. But this is really hard to accomplish. So if you go and read the papers that I've listed at the bottom here, you'll see that how people are trying to accomplish this is by making really, really, really small groups, which shows the unfortunate truth. Fairness in AI is always going to be about trade-offs, and you need to decide which ones you are willing to make. Because even if your data is perfect and your predictions 100% accurate, it may still not be fair. As Deborah Hellman says here, the data may themselves be accurate, but the disparities they reflect may themselves be caused by prior injustice. And note that this type of unfairness can simply be reflective of real-life bias. So like an American CV screening tool that really clearly reflected years of biased recruiting. So much so that when it was analyzed, they found that the two factors the algorithm had decided were the most predictive of good future job performance was that your name was Jared and that you had played high school lacrosse. That's what I use, actually. But also note that something even worse might be happening. You might be making the system even more biased as you go. You might be making the world even more unfair. Like when geographical crime predictions are used to decide how many police you locate in different areas, the crime data in that model actually doesn't represent actual occurrence of crime. It represents the crimes that were policed and recorded. And if you have more police somewhere, you will certainly police more crimes and record more crimes. And therefore you will continue the cycle and you will be feeding it back in. Which is why definitions of fairness, privacy, transparency, interpretability, and morality should remain firmly in the human domain. You can still use some models to try to measure fairness, but you're still going to have to decide where you stand on it yourself. And ideally, you should make that decision before you come and have to make a hard choice. So let's loop back to our 5-year-old. The next lesson is remember to share. And like a 5-year-old, this is one that people find hard and need to work on. But if you believe you have done the right thing, you should be able to stand over it. And if something goes awry, if unfair decisions are being made by your machine learning system, you need to be able to work out why that happened, which is why transparency and explainability are so important. Now, we really don't have time to delve into that, but I have included a whole pile of tools you can go and take a look at and start to explore. But remember that while these can help you, they will not give you all the answers. Another part of sharing is accountability. If someone else decided to share for you, would you feel okay about it? Would you be happy to go on the news and defend what you had built? Would you genuinely be able to say that you had thought carefully about the impacts of what you built, that you monitored and you took action when unexpected things happened? We love to say, assume positive intent, but it counts for nothing here. The creators of the Midas system may have had the best intents. It didn't matter. They still destroyed people's lives. And the standard engineering mantra of move fast and break things shouldn't be applied unilaterally. When there could be serious impacts, you need to take the time to really think about it, about how you can make things better. And to do that, you're going to have to embrace your inner 5-year-old again and open your minds to new possibilities. That's just the way things are, said no one who has heard this talk ever again. The problems may be hard, the solutions may be harder, but if you work in software, you're already a problem solver. You already know how to be creative. Embrace that, especially when you get to the hard stuff. You know, the average 5-year-old smiles or laughs hundreds of times a day. The average adult, less than 20. We lose something in growing up. We see all the problems, and sometimes we see only the problems. Because ethics isn't about, deciding how many people you're going to kill with your trolley, or bashing developers, or blaming technology for all the evil in the world, or even just making you feel guilty. exactly like John said, reframe it. It's about creating a world that's better for everyone. For everyone. Remember, we're approaching this with open minds. We have unlimited imagination. Don't jump to, oh, it's not really possible. Come on, smile. You're at home. Nobody can see you. Nobody can see you. Every day you build worlds. You imagine things that don't exist and you conjure them into being. You have so much power, more than you know. All you need to do is to choose to use it for good.
Yay, thank you so much. That was an excellent talk. So if I can just ask a few questions.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, of course, the joke in the industry that you can't leave security until the last minute. Otherwise, when would you do internationalization? Yeah. So if we're going to make fairness testing part of the process, well, then, like all the other ITs testings, it might get left until the end. So do we need some kind of legal enforcement? Do we need sanctions? Do we need some way of making it a formal part of the process that can never be ignored?
I think there's always a combination of things. I think that sometimes regulation is needed, but also I think we kind of need to step up and take responsibility for what we're creating. Not everything you do in your sort of engineering excellence and when you're doing the right thing, building software is, you know, legally mandated, but we still know it's the right thing to do. Nobody's going to come and arrest you if you don't write all your unit tests. Gareth might come. you still know it's the right thing to do, and
Yes.
it should be something. I do think that considering the human impact, doing the testing for transparency, explainability, you should be building that in upfront. You should be thinking about it before you start, and you should be rechecking it, you know, as you go along.
And that kind of leads on to the next question then. So I don't know if there was a crisis in psychology a few years back where they discovered that most psychology experiments were being done by psychology students, and psychology students were not typical of the population at large. You know, they were often one side of the curve. So therefore, everything that ever been done in psychology ever was inherently suspect. So, you know, if we as software engineers appoint ourselves as kind of judge and jury in this kind of thing, aren't we about to make the same mistake? Because, you know, we're often one side of the graph as well.
Well, that's why you need to get more people involved in those discussions. It's definitely not an easy thing to do, but the more people you can get involved, the more voices you can hear, the more things you can learn from other people, because we definitely don't think about a lot of things. Like probably most people who work in software don't think about the fact that there is people who don't have a credit card, who maybe don't even have a bank account. So, you know, you may be excluding a whole pile of people from using your software. And if you're taking away other things and forcing them to use that, then you probably don't have any, you know, you're like, oh, everybody has a credit card, of course. Or nobody would want to do that job. That's really boring. I would hate that. So I think we have to find ways to talk to a wider group of people.
Very good. Yep. And then final question there. Do you think it's a false expectation that there's any way of creating an ML process that isn't biased, you know, regardless of the inclusion of people?
I think, do you know what? Yeah, the world is not perfect and nothing you build will ever be perfect, but I honestly think we have to try. I think we have to try. And we have to try and get as close as we can. And then the most important thing is that you monitor, that you keep an eye on what's happening and you are measuring. If unexpected things are happening, you know what you're going to do up front if you find out something really bad is happening. So don't wait until some reporter does an expose and to find out something's horribly wrong with your system and that you didn't even know about. So I think it's just about iteratively trying to get better.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you so much. So if I can banish you for now, and if I can call on Andrew.
Hello, hello.
Very good. You have the control.
Alrighty, as usual, I've changed my plans at the very last second, so this could all go horribly wrong. We should have something presenty. Okay, hello. So we'll kick this off with, we started off with a discussion about Aristotle, and we always got to go back to the Greeks. So around 2,220 years ago, Archimedes said, "Give me a place to stand and I will move the world." Archimedes has come to be rightly associated with many fundamental innovations in mathematics and engineering. And while I'm sure we're all sick and tired of screws and levers and jumping out of bathtubs, I'd like to start off with a discussion on one of his more mundane creations, the compound pulley. The Greek biographer Plutarch describes an interaction between Archie and King Hero of Syracuse, where Archimedes boasts that he can pretty much move or lift anything. The king was naturally a bit dubious of this, but being a king, had a few massive warships lying around that required hundreds of men to maneuver in and out of port. So put Archie's wild claims to the test. As the story goes, Archie shows up with what we now call a compound pulley system and pulls the king's warship along the dock with his relatively frail body pulling arm over armfuls of rope. Each chained pulley multiplies the expressed force of the previous pretty much for as many layers as you like, trading distance for force. This today seemingly simple technical innovation would find applications right across human experience. Archie wasn't the first to use a pulley and was almost certainly not the first to come up with the compound pulley, and was definitely not the first to use pulleys and to make military maneuvers easier. But Archimedes went beyond the simple application of his stated creations like the lever, the water screw, and the compound pulley to actually go and mathematically characterize their operation and performance, making these inventions shareable and teachable. And in this day and age, we might even say scalable. This and advances after it created the whole philosophy of engineering as we see it today. We know that to move a boulder, we need a rock and a big stiff stick. We know that I can throw a thing further if it's on a big swinging arm longer than my paltry, stubby, fleshy one. We can plan power stations to generate a given amount of energy based on what fuel is available and how much is needed. We can model how deep a submarine of a particular construction can go before being crushed by the pressure of the water above it. We can plot trajectories that can get us to the moon or otherwise, and we can build machines that break apart the fundamental building blocks of the universe just to find out what happens or to cause more instantaneous destruction than any act in prior human history. In this virtual room, I suspect we're all familiar with the term STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This quartet of creation gives us the means to do seemingly impossible things, standing on the shoulders of giants and taking insights that took millennia to be developed, plugging a few of them together and making something entirely new. My name is Andrew Bolster, and I'm the team lead of the data science team at White Hat Security. I'm also a director at your friendly neighborhood hackerspace, Farsight Labs. And in past lives, I've worked on 4G telecoms that definitely don't cause coronavirus, been an autonomous systems and AI researcher for the defense establishment, designing communications networks for smart submarines, and I've tried to teach machines how to read and respond to human emotions. And in hopefully the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking about the missing E from STEM, ethics, and how within this burgeoning field of data science, we have a serious ethics problem, and potentially how we can work towards redressing it. So I'm going to be approaching this under three main themes or stories. Ethical optimization via our old friend, the trolley problem. A little bit of discussion about unscrupulous actors.
Just to break in for a wee second, your speaker notes are visible, just to say.
Oh, fantastic. Where are those?
Yeah, those things you're on there. Yeah. Yay. Very good.
That's visible? Weird. Okay. Thanks. So where was I? Unscrupulous actors, perverse incentives, and random interruptions. Sorry. Bernhardson's colliery via its complicated friend Facebook. And finally, Asilomar, or how an attempt to mess with carcinogenic monkey virus led to what I believe might be a depressingly bureaucratic but optimistically pragmatic approach to maybe not putting the genie back in the bottle, but at least putting a leash on it. So let's see if I can keep anywhere near time. I think there's a bracket in the Slack room, so put me down for a tenner on 26 minutes total. In recent years, the trolley problem has gone from being a niche, abstract, philosophical thought experiment through to culturally accepted meme lordery via being an overused crutch of AI practitioners and mouthpieces like me. We all know the story by now. There's a somehow unstoppable, indestructible trolley barreling down the tracks heading for some number of immobilized people, say 5 in this creative example. You, as an innocent bystander, see this calamity and can predict what is going to happen if you do nothing. You also can see that on another siding, some other number of people, in this case one, are similarly restrained, and you can predict what happens if you pull the lever. You, dear bystander, can act to choose to reroute the trolley, killing one to save 5. And as we're all good Vulcans, we can confidently act to maximize the number of lives. After all, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or in this case, that particular unfortunate one. So what we've got here is a good old-fashioned optimization problem. And okay, it's clear that more lives are saved by acting in this case. But I'm sure we sat through talks that then go on at length about the combinations of the saps on each track, whether there's a guy you can push off a bridge somewhere, or if there's a baby on one side and an old person on the other, to the point where you eventually work out that the exchange rate between baby and OAP is something like 3.235 or whatever. That's not what I want to talk about. Any machine learning system, as well as most data science research, is a form of optimization system. You feed it data, you give it some way of knowing if it's good or not, and the decisions or recommendations pop out of a trained model. These models are generally educated on goodness by what we would call a fitness function, and usually, and thankfully, it's rarely that simple. But let's say that you do a global study and you somehow create this huge matrix of different people's decisions so that you can confidently aggregate and say what normal would be in a given situation. That sounds like a pretty awesome solution, literally crowdsourcing ethics, we buns. But as usual, MIT already did it. In 2017, they ran a study with 70,000 participants across 42 countries. And while the whole paper is a fascinating read, I'll give you an easy highlight and move on. To cherry pick, in 82% of responses, Germans, like most Europeans, did a Spock and sacrificed the one to save the many. However, in China, that number is closer to 58%. And China's not some surprising outlier either. There's a smorgasbord of variations in judgment calls that are correlated within regions, but vary across regions. There is no global definition of what a socially moral act is. And indeed, if you just took the straight average, more people would disagree with it than would agree with it. And this is in quite possibly the simplest ethical question that we can ask. Are we saving lives or not? So we can't optimize for ethics because no one can or will agree on what ethics is. So let's abandon the optimization and maybe look at some other nasty stories that we can cover. And it's always Facebook. In 2008, Facebook proudly announced their Connect API. This enabled truly portable social login and also enabled app developers across the world to access the use of social web to recommend, engage, and customize their experiences. Fun fact, their proudly launched blog post has since disappeared from their official website, but go figure. But we had apps like Event B turned your friends into mini ticket masters by enabling them to take a cut of virally recommended ticket sales. Netflix let you share movie ratings within your friend group, and hell, the Watchmen Blu-ray had the ability to invite your friends for simultaneous watch parties, which would have been handy right about now. This was the dawn of a new age for the web. Everything was connected to everyone, and the experience was optimized on a per-user basis rather than requiring some bulk data access API or something similarly crazy. And then the quizzes started. Netizens of a particular age remember the day before Facebook quizzes exploded and the day after. It was hell, and it made no sense. But you just ignored your dumbass mate's posts and move on with your life. By 2014, Facebook had killed its next generation social network, and years later, we found out why. But the genie was out of the bottle, and the world has already changed. But how? How did a proliferation of pointless quizzes and single-purpose app integrations lead to the global manipulation of public opinion on an industrially mechanized scale? Well, friends, it started off with people like us, technologists, data scientists, researchers, academics, numerical fiddlers. Between 2007 and 2016, the University of Cambridge Psychometric Centre, which is part of the Judge Business School, ran a quiet little side project called My Personality that, like many other psychometric research groups across the world, leveraged the kind of viral social media reach that the Connect API enabled to run playful personality tests to tell you what kind of dog you are or whatever. But these results were genuinely used for bona fide, ethically moderated research into the social and psychological questions of the day. The API itself provided a perverse incentive for data-driven researchers. The more people that you can get to run the quiz, the more second-order people that you can collect demographic and interest metadata for. So that even if the friends of your obsessive compulsive quiz taker never touched or consented to your friendly little app, you still had the movies that they liked, the pages that they liked, the artists that they followed, and the mutual friends with the quiz taker, all on the table for collection. Today, we call this kind of thing triangulation, but at this time, it was just an interesting research context to characterize different quiz responses into different social buckets like age, race, occupation, economic status, education, beliefs, and what kind of posts that you would like. The quizzes themselves, through psychometric aggregation, could score people on estimates like respect for authority, voting intention, media savviness, neuroticism, and more. And I have to confess, I played with the same data sets that eventually got called the Cambridge Analytical Files. I was at the University of Liverpool at the time researching trust networks for applications in autonomous systems. So borrowing structures and activities from human social networks made sense. I requested access, I got vetted for my purposes by diligent academics, and I played with the things that I asked for and no more. All good, sounds nice. And then one academic accidentally published their access credentials onto GitHub, and they were there for over 4 years. No, too early for that one. The story of what the evidently unscrupulous actors of SCL and Cambridge Analytica did with that data is better documented in other places. But I want to talk about Facebook's handling of the situation. Frankly, Facebook didn't give a poop that there was an aggregated data set of millions of its users, which was obviously a massive violation of the Connect API's T's and C's. And it's not like they didn't know about it. A Facebook employee applied to access the data, but this was rejected by the vetters on the case that it was commercial use. And it's here that I want to break off for a second and go to the slide that you've all seen already. I think that most of us are aware of Hanlon's razor, to never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. It's a fantastic way to stress less about our reptilian overlords and pizza shop basements. But I've come across what I've termed Bernhardt's corollary, and I'm probably pronouncing that terribly. But never attribute to stupidity that which can be explained by opportunity cost. Facebook didn't plan for their data to be misused by unscrupulous actors, and they weren't too stupid to think about it. And while Zuckerberg might look inhuman whenever he's supping on dihydrogen monoxide, given the choice between a deep state conspiracy to elect a glorified car salesman and prioritized shipping features over data governance, my bet is always going to be with overworked data scientists, developers, and product managers running on a Sisyphusian treadmill. It's easy to say, yeah, that's a nice API and all, but what if someone doesn't adhere to our lazy, unenforceable rules for legitimate research purposes, the exact same research purposes that they internally did for fun? And what about if an internal, and what if a private firm works out how to access the aggregate data and use it to isolate and manipulate filter bubbles for the highest bidder? Wargaming data governance what-if scenarios isn't prioritized at an executive level. It wasn't something that could be quantified on a burn down or allocated story points. And it was never going to end up in investor briefings or press releases. Well, until it made it into the congressional record. But we can't just poop over Zuck for this one. Our meme-tastic interweb has an applicable ding on those supposedly responsible for oversight too. Policymakers are supposed to be experts in policy. Politicians are supposed to be experts in, well, something. But it's not data science or generally ethics. And modern corporate governance that has even eschewed internal research teams to optimize for the bottom line can't be expected to be informed enough to self-govern in a way that covers the explosive possibilities of the connected world. And when public bodies do try and create these kind of structures, they inevitably run into massive obstacles, particularly in implementation, with technologists tearing their remaining hair out, wondering what the hell does appropriate measures to prevent de-anonymization mean? I'm looking at you, GDPR. They can't prepare for unforeseen consequences, and they can't see the perverse incentives until long after they've pushed their beautiful, well thought out code. So crowdsourced ethics makes no one happy. Corporate entities don't account for moral failure on their balance sheets, and socioeconomics prevents governments from effectively legislating this kind of thing. What about practitioners and our wonderful cancerous monkeys? In 1974, a biochemist at Stanford called Paul Berg designed an experiment to stuff bits of a carcinogenic monkey virus into some E. coli bacteria. But when he shared his proposed experiment protocol, he got a very, very mixed response from the scientific community at the time. Long story short, they believed that it could cause a quickly spreading cancer-causing viral pathogen. Fun times. But instead of pulling a Frankenstein, the 1975 Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA was held with over 100 internationally respected molecular biologists and associated stakeholders in attendance, with Berg as its chair. They established a set of guidelines to be followed by all scientists doing this kind of research. They considered several classes of experiment and assigned relative levels of risk from minimal to high, each level of risk requiring a corresponding set of containment procedures designed to minimize the chance of carriers from escaping into the wider world and, in our established parlance, unforeseen consequences. This included the forbiddance of certain classes of experiments, such as using materials from highly infectious or toxic genomes, or running experiments to produce large amounts of reagents. These guidelines were predominantly socially enforced rather than being legislated, with a significant strand of the conference discussing the importance of operating in the open and bringing their science into the public eye. Some commentators suggest that this is a reflection of the distrust of government in the wake of the Watergate scandal, such that it was easier for the public to trust scientists following scientific consensus than it was to trust scientists following government-derived and potentially variably enforced legislation. The generation of an open consensus within a community of practitioners and experts led to an increasingly positive view of the field within the general public. Somewhat ironically, from our vantage point 50 years later, this enabled specialists who had previously confined themselves to academia to develop ties into the private sector as shareholders or as executives or as consultants, engaging with private industry in a constructive way because their biomolecular Hippocratic oath provided a stability and a confidence to explore new innovations and opportunities safely. Berg went on to earn the 1980 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and by the 20th anniversary of the conference in '95, genetics and its terminology had become part of the day-to-day vocabulary and not something restricted to the hallowed halls of university or private research establishments. I'd argue that if it's good enough for cancer-causing simian stomach bugs, it's good enough for data science. Efforts along these lines are already active, and I would encourage you all as practitioners and interested parties to take part. There's many data ethics projects across the world, as well as Gillian's human impact statements. Some of them are open source, such as the Open Ethics Canvas from the Open Data Institute, or public sector, such as the gov.uk's data ethics framework, which, while being good, has no interesting graphics associated with it other than Matt Hancock's face, which I won't subject you to. As well as this, there are a range of ad hoc and drifting towards professional standards being developed for data governance and ethical data science. Of particular interest to me at the minute, and yes, this is selfish, is IEEE's proposed 7000 series of standards on ethically aligned design, which ranges from the likes of 703, that's concerned with algorithmic bias considerations, and 02, which is data privacy processes, and one of the weirder ones, and a bit of a mouthful, Standard for Ethical Considerations in Emulated Empathy in Autonomous and Intelligent Systems, which is a fancy way of saying that it's thinking about systems that quantify, respond to, or simulate emotion. And of course, I sit on the working group for the weird one. These groups bring together a wide and diverse range of voices to interrogate and twist the use and potential misuse of data science, software development, data privacy, and autonomous systems, developing shared standards and guidelines to which we as a community of practice can adhere. And it's far from perfect. The bureaucracy involved in engaging a community of practitioners of thousands is not without its challenges. With the ever-taunting pressures of just get it done hanging over us all the time, we have to ask the question, how do we do this? So we've covered the challenges of mathematically operating in an ethical world. the inevitable challenge of unforeseen consequences. And as usual in software engineering, we think we might be able to steal from another field and take their good ideas to save our own skins. What does this all mean as a data scientist today? Frankly, it's a fraught time to be a data scientist. I don't have any easy answers. With an analytical background and the usual laundry list of skills that this industry desires, you're used to developing tools against constraints. But when there's no accepted or potentially even possible standard against which to measure your work ethically, how can you write code or interpretations of data that you can stand behind? If the ethics is unaccountable and uncostable, how do we progress with any kind of confidence as an industry? Or do we just resign ourselves and say that data science as an art is the art of fulfilling the lies, damn lies, and statistics of aphorism, or getting trapped in Gillian's get it done environment? For years, I considered myself an engineer above being a scientist, approaching problems in a practical mindset of how do we do the thing that satisfies the requirements in the most practical, elegant way. But these days I've been forced to accept that we don't know what the thing is. The requirements will be written by the headlines 5 years later, and the best we can hope for is for a generation of data scientists, developers, engineers, product managers, customers, and stakeholders to take a pragmatic approach to assess the second order risks like perverse incentives and the acceptance that there are unscrupulous actors that are generally more ingenious than we are. And that to take a step back and remember that ethical optimization is at best a heuristic rather than an algorithm or a function that we can call. And above all, to try and leave the world a little better and a little better documented than we find it. It's on us as an industry and as a field to hold each other accountable and to question and support each other's decisions pragmatically, fairly, and openly. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was an amazing presentation. I look forward to reviewing it at 50% speed. So brilliant.
Well, that's why we're recording, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the whole purpose. So if I can start off with a question of my own. So there's an expression beloved in politics and especially loved by a prominent local politician who I may or may not be married to, which is that disinfectant is the best, sunlight is the best disinfectant, you know. So at the end of the day, is that the principle we're returning to? Are we saying that things are running so far ahead that just public exposure is the best thing that we have?
In the current climate, I think it's dangerous taking advice from politicians talking about the power of sunlight. But what I would say is, yes, I mean, I've been an advocate for open science and open data for years at this point, and I find that the only way that you can actually get the eyes on these kind of questions and to be able to have these critical discussions that we need to be having with each other, you got to share your work. I mean, it's one of the things that I've been advocating for over the past couple of years is pushing governments to use not necessarily open data. There are legitimate privacy concerns. There are legitimate questions around triangulation to say, why can't the government just give us all the data that they have? But what they should be able to do is to give us the methods. How are they using the data internally? What transformations are they doing? What analysis are they doing? So that we as a community of practice of data scientists and engineers can look at their methods and say, yes, that's the right way of doing it, or no, that's a really risky way of doing that.
Very good. And then, reading off the questions list here. So do you think there's a way to ensure tech companies adhere to ethical standards when their processes are often proprietary and guarded from the public?
There's a couple of ways of answering that. There's the easy one that says, oh yeah, but you know, no data scientist worth their salt would work with a company like that. That's just a straight out lie. We know that people will go for the highest bidder, and even if we had everybody somehow in the industry agreeing to a set of practice, there's always going to be one unscrupulous actor that is perfectly happy throwing away their ethics and going, yeah, sure, I'll solve that. That looks like an interesting problem, and not thinking about the second order effects. The short answer is to ensure It's to sue them out of existence. And whenever these things do come out in the headlines 5 years later, they should just be, if we're going to treat companies like people, then maybe companies need to be locked up for life. And we need to name and shame. We need to have a very solid whistleblower ecosystem as well, in terms of specialists within organizations being able to have an outlet to be able to say, I think that something is wrong here, to be able to break those proprietary and guarded practices and, again, bring a little bit of sunlight.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So do you think this is something that's improving? I'm just reading off the questions again here. Do you see a change in working culture, that people are taking this more seriously these days?
It's only really in the past couple of years that we've actually worked out what the hell data science actually means as a profession, So I think we're still finding our way. We're still it's still very early days to get to that. I think it would be nice if we had better representation in terms of professional communities of practice. We're kind of slumped somewhere between the software development, software engineering world and the sort of academic research world, and we've kind of got stuck in that gap where we still, just want to solve problems, but we also have a sort of social responsibility to do better. So it's not easy. I think we're getting there, but it's not easy.
Very good. And one final question, which I wanted to ask, and it's also being asked on the questions list there, so I'll ask it my way. So acknowledging how seductive this is, because I've experienced this myself, so if I'm on Facebook and somebody says, can we do a quiz to work out your political leanings? I'm like, no. Okay, how about a quiz to work out which Babylon 5 character you most resemble? Hell yeah, I'll do that, absolutely. So are there any good tools or strategies that we can use to educate the general public, within which I include myself, so that we're more aware of how our data can be used and we're less gullible for this kind of thing?
I think, yes, but it's a long pathway. So taking the Cambridge Analytica story, the headline for that story goes something like this: greedy company used data from Facebook to modify people's, or to exacerbate, to adjust people's behavior. It's very easy to then have the blame game basically go, oh, these people were evil. Why did Facebook let them do this? The issue is that, as I said, going through this, it's more complex than that. What actually happened had much more nuance to it, where it was well-intentioned, well-controlled data governance was totally controlled. It went through all of the ethical certification. It was all signed off by everybody. And then a simple mistake potentially let people in to completely circumvent all of those policy decisions that were made to prevent something bad happening. I think in terms of education, we need to think further beyond and kind of go, look, poop happens. And we have to educate people and say, look, it is not the responsibility of, or it is not only the responsibility of company X, be that Facebook or Netflix or whatever. It is not solely their responsibility in terms of having custodianship of your data. It's also about how much of yourself are you trading with these different entities. I mean, I legitimately, I've been sharing or storing my location data using, it used to be called Google Latitude way back in the day, but it's now just location services. So I have a history of my movement every day for the past 10 or 15 years or something like that. I know that Google already had that information. My ethical trade has been, I want access to the data as well. That's my trade. You can still have that to do all of your fancy stuff that you want to do to tell me where the nearest pizza shop is, but I still want access to the data. So having that data trade be a conversation rather than just being, oh, right here, have everything you can learn about me and do whatever you like with it.
Yes, very good. Yeah. So then once data becomes open, and available to anybody, is there any way to prevent it being used in bad faith?
Prevent? No. It would be easier to say, when can we disband the police? whenever it comes to anything, you were saying that there was a conversation about ethical gray areas. There's always money. You know, in any situation like that, you are going to have people that operate in bad faith. You know, we don't live in a you know, Star Trekian utopia, and even in the Star Trek utopia, there are bad faith actors. So, you know, how do you? I think I've got the screen on this. I think John's question was, how do you deal with it being used? How do you respond to it being used? There was an interesting example of this, not necessarily of bad faith acting, but of potentially a what I would describe as a bad faith response to a issue with open data. The Department of Health in Northern Ireland had a really nice COVID-19 dashboard fairly early on that had information about you know, bed capacity and hospital A&E waiting times, and had this relatively early. And then at some point, somebody said that data is not quite right, or there was some privacy leak. They haven't actually been very forthcoming with why they did this, but their response was to shut the whole thing down, kill everything, close off everything, because it was their self-defense mechanism. It was, somebody has done something weird with our data, so get it out. No one can touch it at all. To kind of put a bit of a lever on Gillian's point about treating everybody like they're 5-year-olds, it is not a good data governance policy to huff and go off and grab your toys and run off. Whenever people do stuff that is bad, we need to treat it the same way that it's potentially slander or something like that. There is, you are doing a misrepresentation or a misuse of a something that somebody has effectively said, or in this case written, whenever it's data. So I think there are actually political and legal remedies rather that are going to be more effective at this than just expecting technology to rise up and say, oh yeah, no, we've got a fix for this. Because as several elements in the talk discussed, we can't trust technology to get this all right, because we can't trust technologists to get it right all the time.
Fair enough. Very good. So final question before we bring everybody else back. So what are your thoughts on traffic from certain countries being treated as suspicious by default?
This is an interesting one. So my day job is with White Hat Security, where we predominantly do web application security and analysis. But in a previous life, I was with another company that was network-based intrusion detection. So we had sensors all over the world that were monitoring and logging and basically keeping an eye out for nasty traffic. And we did, if I remember correctly, and I hope I don't end up in court over all of this, we did have a system that was kind of saying, oh, it looks like it's coming from China, that's probably nasty. The thing is that whenever you look at the statistics, that was generally a good recommendation to make. It was, if you took the set of packets that you have observations of, and you take the set of your Venn diagram of which of those are discovered or identified as being actively malicious, a significant subset of those would be coming from Chinese-oriented IP addresses. So then whenever you sort of turn that inference on its head and you go, I have a new packet, I haven't had time to inspect it for active maliciousness, but I know it's coming from China. So I can effectively assign a likelihood, a probability of saying, if coming from China, chance of being vulnerable equals 0.78 or something like that. That's reasonable to make certain decisions. But one of the things we don't talk about enough in data science is the sort of bounds for decision making. And you know, what advice from ML and data science systems? How do you act on it? How do you make sure that you don't just have a runaway decision system that just automatically flags everything as everything Chinese is bad? Right, that's an inference too far. So that's why I think data scientists as a profession are almost there to like walk that weird boundary between the numerical and the sort of subject matter expertise, where you're going, can I use this numerical evidence to appropriately inform this subject matter decision? And I think that line has to be drawn very, very tightly. But to wrap up Glenn's point, it coming from a Chinese IP address is a reasonable factor to inform a decision. There's nothing wrong with that.
Very good, grand. Excellent. Well, we're getting close to time. So at this stage, if I could invite all the other presenters to come on as well. So if you could just turn on your video and audio. And if I can step back for a moment and give you an opportunity to ask each other any questions that you might like to.
I think we asked each other the questions in our presentations anyway. I think it was we were answering each other already. So
everything does seem to have tied together very well. Excellent, cool.
Part of the plan.
So I have a question for the other two guys. So what is the role and what is our responsibility as technologists in being in solidarity with those oppressed by technology?
Ooh. It depends on who. I think that comes down to a personal choice rather than a professional choice.
But do you think there is a responsibility of us to consider that our privilege and power and position, that we should consider using solidarity mechanisms to influence the world?
What mechanism? Are you thinking of particular mechanisms? I mean, if they're being oppressed by technology and your job is creating technology, I think you definitely have some responsibility there.
There's an interesting, it's not quite directly facing your question, but there's an interesting philosophy in the cybersecurity world, which is if you're a good enough hacker, you either end up in prison or employed by the NSA, or usually both. And you know, cybersecurity fundamentally is a cat and mouse game, where we're constantly sitting there going, how are the bad guys going to mess with this? And then they're sitting there going, how are the good guys going to get in our way? And this adversarial back and forth is actually very reminiscent to one of the more interesting neural network architectures that's come out in the past couple of years, of those generative adversarial networks that make like this is not a cat, this is not a face, this is, you know, so I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, where you're going, we as technologists have an opportunity to inform as well as provide solidarity, where we can contextualize why these technological issues emerge, so that it's not just, oh, those gosh darn technologists have it in for people of color, or those darn machines and their decision to support whatever political faction. We have a responsibility to sort of push back context and say, here's why bad thing X happened. It's not just that people are evil.
I think John, you said it very well when you said, you know, when you make things better for other people, you make them better for yourself and for everyone. And I think sometimes businesses are like, well, we're here to make money and we're not here to sort of do everything for everyone. But you know, Alexa doesn't need to cover all the accents in the world, you know, we're just, as long as it's covering the people who have the most money, you know, do we really need to cover everyone? But at the end of the day, if you cover more accents, you are making a better system that's going to work, hopefully better for everyone. So I do think that there is advantages in actually sort of thinking outside and going, yeah, okay, it's going to be a bit more effort. And it may seem like, well, you know, is it really worth it? But on the other hand, I think if you aren't going to do that, then maybe be upfront, maybe be willing to say, no, well, we're not considering these people, but that's what we're doing. And if you're not willing to say that upfront and stand over it, then, you know, why are you doing it?
Yeah, so be explicit about your biases. You know, talk about where it is in your position. Yeah, and it is a question about the technologist outside of the company and corporation. I agree with Gillian. I think that context, and I am asking that question, which is, and I think, and you know, my response is the education responsibility thing. You know, we shouldn't be looked at, I think, as experts to answer questions. We should help educate people so they could get to the answers. And I think that's where it becomes ethics as ethics in the societal sense, because I argue there's not necessarily tech ethics and ethics. So that's why I'm asking that question.
Very good. So if I could finish by asking one final question to all of you. So well, one of the things I teach in another role is that it's human nature to freeze. You know, it's kind of encoded into our DNA. So, you know, as part of evolution, that, you know, your body says to you, what you've done so far hasn't got you killed yet, so keep doing it. You know, so given that the technologies are evolving very, very quickly, you know, and I think we can all agree on that. Is there a point where human nature lets us down? I mean, that's part of the essence of the trolley problem, that we think there's something special about us pulling the handle. It's our own agency, and our urge to freeze kicks in. So is there a point where we as human beings are just too stupid to keep control of all this?
If I could jump in on that one, there's a really interesting problem with the trolley problem, which I didn't have time to squeeze into this one. And it comes down to the story of the Tesla that ran into the cyclist who jumped out of the bush. Yes. It's really, really weird that we hold electrified glass to higher ethical standards than we set to humans, because we make this inference about reaction times. So it's this freezing concept of saying, right, it's your system 1 and system 2 thinking. How quickly do you make that response? The same thing applies in technical systems and in data science and machine learning systems. It is a constant compromise between time, cost, and potentially ethics in this case, where you're going, right, can I make a decision or a decision tree that can be navigated in a short enough period of time that I can accept? And you can build a system that waits for a really long time and is very confident in its answers and is generally pretty good. Or you make something that goes really fast, but it makes a mistake 1 in a million times. The question becomes, is it acceptable for that 1 in a million time to be, say, a cyclist coming out of behind a bush? Or then you take it on to the next level of, do you just look at human accident statistics and say, once we get that far, the machine is good enough? And then you ask the question of, why not let the machine go on and be better than us and be more capable potentially? So we're drifting into some interesting transhumanism questions, but I think that human factors analysis is really, really challenging.
Very good. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm going to completely challenge the premise of both the question and the answer.
Go for it.
So I liked the fact you brought up the MIT study, because I was horrified by it, because I think it was Williams, or the guy called Williams, pointed out that the trolley problem is a question of decision and rationality, and it's more about psychology, which is more of a black art than philosophy, and it's not the basis on which humans execute or make ethical decisions, what we call ethical decisions, but they're not really. They're called living and reacting to the world, which I think is sort of partly Garth's question. So I think it's a false reality. And if you were to take that, and the horror situation is, oh well, let's average out, should you kill the baby or should you run over the old person? That's a crowdsourcing thing, and this is like running a referendum. It's very immediate about this kind of stuff, and that goes to the agency question, which I think Gillian was alluding to as well. Is where is the agency, and keep it in the humans? And I think the stuff you were saying, Andrew, the IEEE stuff is a similar kind of thing. So your question about the timeliness and the reactiveness and doing those kind of things, I think we're almost asking the wrong questions. We've been distracted by the Enlightenment because we are, rationalists, because we do computers and all this kind of stuff. This is my line. I think we need to grow up and realize that Enlightenment ethics failed. That idea of rationalism, and that you can do rule sets and there are ways of thinking. I think it's an interesting perspective, and hence why it's one of the perspectives I still think we have to look at, but it failed. Philosophy used to be the cool stuff. It failed and became an academic subject because they couldn't come up with a rationalist way of actually describing how we make decisions, and agency was that key thing. And Nietzsche is your man if you want to really hear him take the Enlightenment to pieces. So I think there is kind of we're asking the wrong question, and it is like, that somebody stepping out of the bush. Well, what if we changed the whole system? What if we said, you can't step out of a bush, let's make automated vehicles work, but there are special things for it and the humans don't interfere? Would the world be better? Would it be a more just place? Or would it be only certain people can afford those kind of cars, and that would actually be a worse thing? And there's, you know, the bad old roads where people die and the good roads. So I think it's a bigger subject, and I think, you know, I'd argue that you're asking a rationalist question, and I'm challenging the premise of your question.
Very good. Very good. Well, I feel a strong personal urge to continue this on, but I feel there is a stronger economic argument and an opportunity cost for finishing at this point. So I would just like to say thank you so much for everybody. This has been fascinating. This has been great. So thank you so much to the presenters and to all of you who attended. By the way, it was awesome. I think we got more than 100 people signed up to this, you know, which for a talk on ethics, as opposed to, like, you know, something important like Haskell or something, you know. So they're really, really good. So listen, thank you everybody involved, and hope to see you again next time. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the invite, Gareth. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers, folks.